Friends, colleagues, esteemed guests, good evening. My name is Paul Nimmo, and I'm the King's Chair of Systematic Theology here in the Department of Divinity, and I'm the Chair of the Gifford Lectures Committee. We gather this evening for the first in our Bicentenary series of 2022 Gifford Lectures. The Gifford Lectures are named after the prominent Scottish advocate and judge, Lord Adam Gifford, who died in 1887. In his will, he provided for a series of lectures to be delivered at the four ancient Scottish universities, Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and St Andrews. The lectures were to be with a view to promoting, advancing, teaching and diffusing the study of natural theology in the widest sense of the term. Since 1888, the Gifford Lectures have become one of the most renowned public intellectual events in the fields of theology, philosophy, ethics, and religion anywhere in the world. Here in Aberdeen alone, Gifford Lectures have been delivered by luminaries as significant and as varied as Alfred North Whitehead, Etienne Gilson, Karl Barth, Hannah Arendt, Richard Swinburne, Paul Tillich, Eleanor Stump, Sarah Coakley, Mona Siddiqui, and N.T. Wright. Our programme of 2022 lectures commemorates the bicentenary of the birth of Lord Gifford, and to begin the series, we are honoured and delighted to add a further distinguished name to our roster of Aberdeen Gifford lecturers. Our speaker this evening is John Witte Jr., Robert W. Woodruff Professor of Law, McDonald Distinguished Professor of Religion, and Faculty Director of the Centre for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. He is an expert in the fields of legal history, human rights, religious freedom, marriage and family law, and law and religion. In these areas, he has published over 40 books, which have been translated into over 15 languages. Professor Witte, we are thrilled that in your very busy schedule, you have made time for a first visit to Aberdeen in order to be here for this event. I now invite you to the podium to deliver your Gifford Lecture entitled A New Calvinist Reformation of Rights.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you so very much, Professor Minnow, for that wonderful introduction, for your generosity that you have accorded to me and to my wife, Eliza Ellison. Good evening to each of you. It's a great honor to be standing at this world-class Gifford Lectern and to have an opportunity to participate in this bicentenary celebration of Lord Gifford's generosity and his prescience into some of the fundamental questions of nature and natural law, natural rights, natural theology, and the role of human nature itself in some of the fundamental aspects of life. My deepest thanks to Professor Nimmo, to Professor Ziegler, and to members of the faculty of the law school and the divinity school and the generosity they've accorded me, the hospitality they've lavished on me. Thanks to Ms. Paula for her wonderful work in choreography of our proceedings this evening. My wife, Eliza Ellison, and I are just thrilled and overjoyed to have this chance to stand before you. For the past 3 decades, I have been writing on the history and theory and law of human rights and religious freedom. A central focus of this work has been on the historical contribution of the Reformed tradition, Calvinism in particular, to the development of rights in the Western legal tradition. In an earlier title, The Reformation of Rights, I tracked the development of rights talk in Protestant lands inspired by 16th century Genevan reformer John Calvin and his new teachings on authority and liberty and duties and rights and church and state and law and religion. Calvin's original teachings were periodically challenged by major crises in the West. The St. Bartholomew's Massacre and the French Wars of Religion that followed, the Spanish Inquisition and the Dutch Revolt against Spanish authority, the English Revolution and the Civil War that followed, American colonization and the American Revolution. In each such crisis moment, a major Calvinist titan emerged. Theodore Beza in France, Johannes Althusius in the Netherlands, John Milton in England, John Adams in the United States, who modernized Calvin's teachings on rights, resistance, and revolution and converted them into dramatic new legal and political forms and reforms. And this activity helped render early modern Calvinism one of the driving engines of Western constitutionalism. The sequel volume is now on my desk, and that will be my contribution to the Gifford tradition. It is focused on Calvinist contributions to modern rights, from circa 1776, the date of the American Revolution, to 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was promulgated. I shall again be focusing on major events that proved to be watershed moments in the development of rights, challenges like the slave trade and its abolition, the Industrial Revolution and its impact on workers and the environment, the women's rights and suffrage movement and its emergence in temperance as well, the Great Depression and the massive burden of the rights of the poor, World Wars I and II and what it did to prisoners and to refugees the world over. And I shall again be focusing on Calvinist titans who redirected the Calvinist tradition to address these new rights challenges in their day, in accordance with and an extension of the original teachings of John Calvin and his followers. As an illustration of this new project, allow me to use my precious 52 minutes given to me by Professor Nemo to focus on one key development in the evolution of rights, the abolition of chattel slavery and the removal of the transatlantic slave trade. And I take as my case study a Calvinist titan that you doubtless have never heard of before, although he lectured here in Scotland several times in the 1840s and 1850s. And that is the black abolitionist and Presbyterian preacher, the Reverend James W.C. Pennington. Pennington's story is one of hope, resilience, reform, courage, prophecy, and prescience as he navigated the horrible world of chattel slavery and helped to bring about emancipation in the name of rights and liberty, dignity, and equality. Allow me to take you into his world a little bit, and please bear with me with some of the ugliness and violence and racism and misogyny that you will hear in this story and that you will hear in quotes from him. Pennington was born into slavery in the American state of Maryland in 1809. As a young child, he was whipped severely by the master's overseers and raped repeatedly by the master's servants and children. And so he spent long, lonely, and hungry days hiding and freezing in the woods while his parents worked the fields. As a youth, he was periodically leased out to other masters and forced to live away from his parents, often returning starved and beaten. After witnessing the brutal whipping of his own father that maimed his father for life in 1827, Pennington resolved to make a harrowing escape with an eye to getting help for himself and for his family. Twice he was captured by fugitive slave hunters. Twice he escaped again. He made his way to Pennsylvania, where Quakers took him in and provided food and shelter, kindness, a paid job, his first Bible, and his first education. Pennington then moved to New York City and took night classes after working during the day as a footman and coachman. In 1830, Pennington converted to Christianity and immersed himself in learning. He taught himself how to read the Bible, eventually in Greek, and he mastered theology and history and rhetoric. He became the first black man ever to study at Yale University, although he had to sit in the hallway to hear the lectures. And he was ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1838. And for the next 3 decades, Pennington pastored several churches and became a leader, the moderator of the New York City Presbytery. In that same year of 1830, 21-year-old Pennington joined the abolitionist cause and gradually rose to become the leader of the World Abolitionist Society. He worked assiduously for the abolition of slavery and the emancipation or escape of individual slaves. He spent his life savings to ransom 2 of his brothers and father, though to his great grief he could not find his mother and 3 sisters who had been sold off and scattered. Mounting pulpits and lecterns on both sides of the Atlantic, he led efforts to promote temperance, education, family stability, missionary work, and charity among blacks in the United States, the Caribbean, and Africa, and to end racism, segregation, and other forms of injustice in church, state, society, and economy alike. Pennington treated slavery as a form of domestic tyranny, as he called it, that needed to be resisted and removed as an assault on the fundamental norms of dignity, liberty, and equality for all. Much like the 16th century Protestant reformers who revolted against the spiritual tyranny of the medieval church, and much like the 18th century American revolutionaries who revolted against the political tyranny of the English crown, Pennington revolted against what he called the domestic tyranny of the American chattel slave system. He called it blatant hypocrisy for the avowedly Christian nation of America to declare proudly that all men are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights, and then systematically to deny those rights to most of the population, to women, to children, to immigrants, to indentured servants, to Native Americans and African Americans, whether enslaved or free. He called it a monstrous crime for slaves to be treated as items of personal property of their masters rather than as image bearers of their creator God. He called it divine treason to refuse sanctuary and comfort to an escaped slave, to comfort them, or to return slaves to their masters for a proverbial 30 pieces of silver. And he called the American law of slavery a covenant with death and hell that would bring the entire nation under God's judgment and wrath. Pennington's guide throughout this was the mantra of sacred liberty, equality, and dignity for all. And he traced this mantra to various Protestant traditions of rights, resistance, and revolution that he encountered in his work as a Yale divinity student and as an emerging Presbyterian pastor. As he put it in a later sermon, and I quote from him at a bit of length, the Reformation was a contest for the rights of the people in matters of religion and conscience. From his monkish apartments, Martin Luther looked out upon the moral state of his countrymen. He beheld them without the word of God in their own language. He assumed it to be the right of every man to have and to hear God's holy word and to read it for themselves. Luther was especially prompted by his conscience to oppose slavery, whether physical, mental, or religious. It mattered not to him whether the rights of man were attacked by the Pope, the Emperor, or civilian. He resisted that attack upon the authority of his conscience in the fear of God alone. Liberty of conscience he claimed as the birthright of all humankind. End quote. Pennington followed Protestant convention in viewing liberty of conscience as the natural corollary to the sovereignty of God. Liberty of conscience is not the liberty to do as one wishes, but to do as God commands, he insisted. In practice, it requires the liberty to discharge one's spiritual duties, to worship God, to honor God's name, to observe the Sabbath, to avoid idolatry and blasphemy, to enjoy the free exercise of religion. It also includes the right to discharge one's moral duties towards neighbors, to respect a neighbor's rights to life, property, reputation, marriage, household, and business. Pennington further followed Protestant convention in seeing liberty of conscience as what he called the mother of human rights, the wellspring from which all other fundamental rights naturally flowed under the government of God and nature's God. Liberty of conscience is natural to every human being, said Pennington. It is a gift of God to the human race. Conscience claims and requires the exercise of free speech and free publication. It tells a man he has a right to be and to be free. It tells him he has a right to have a lawful wife and children. It tells him that he has a right to enjoy and have all of these in a state of freedom. Every human being has a right to be and to act as such and to possess life, liberty, and pursue happiness, said Pennington. Since the days of Luther, Pennington continued, many Protestant revolutionaries have fought in the name of these God-given religious and civil rights. Liberty, equality, and dignity were their manifestos as they marshaled their protests and revolts against the political tyrants of Germany and France, the Netherlands, England, Scotland, and beyond. These Protestant revolutionaries believed fervently that rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. The American revolutionaries, said Pennington, built on this great tradition in taking up arms against the British and throwing off its tyrannical laws and oppressive rule and declaring themselves free. But many Americans were not free, either in 1776 or in Pennington's day. They still lived under the tyranny, but one now imposed by their own governments rather than some foreign power. Blacks and whites at Pennington, slaves and freemen alike, fought, bled, and died shoulder to shoulder in the American Revolution. They were literally brothers in arms. Yet, notwithstanding the Star-Spangled Banner, notwithstanding the 4th of July orations, Pennington wrote, America has remained for many a land of oppression. While the 1776 Declaration of Independence proudly proclaimed that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, the reality a half-century later was that many Americans were fundamentally unequal and systematically denied many basic rights to property, education, charity, contract, political office, suffrage, and more. And more brutally still, black chattel slaves were denied rights altogether, even the right to legal recognition as human beings, as image bearers of their Creator. Moreover, while the Declaration of Independence heralded the end to the political tyranny of the colonial system, the American Constitution preserved the domestic tyranny of the slavery system. The Constitution allowed the odious Atlantic slave trade to continue for at least a generation, a brutal trade in human flesh and blood that ultimately carried some 12 million Africans to the Americas and killed 3 million more in passage. The Constitution's infamous 3/5 compromise strengthened Southern states by counting their slaves for representation in Congress, even though slaves were discounted as mere chattel at home. And the Constitution established the hated fugitive slave laws that required escaped slaves in free states to be returned to their masters, and there to be reduced again to items of mere property, to be bought, sold, and leased, to be beaten, raped, and starved, to be worked, bred, and boarded like beasts, and foreclosed by state law from the basics of human life: marriage, education, literacy, art, play, paid work, free worship, church life, and much more. Slavery is the very antipode of liberty, Pennington thundered. If it is a self-evident truth that men are born free by the hand of the God of nature, the American Constitution of slavery uproots that hallowed Constitution of nature. It opposes the hand of God. It prostitutes the divine ordinance. It is an act of mortal sinfulness. It is a covenant with death, as Isaiah 28 puts it, an agreement with hell that cannot stand. Pennington attacked slavery with all manner of arguments. He attacked popular biblical arguments of his day that aimed to justify the subjugation and enslavement of Africans. The gospel, rightly understood, taught, received, felt, and practiced, is as anti-slavery as it is anti-sin, he said. Does the gospel sanction cruelty? Does the gospel sanction mangling? Does it sanction starvation? Does it sanction torture and rape? The gospel sanctions none of these, nor the institution of slavery that allows them. The gospel is a story of redemption and liberation, not enslavement and subjugation, he said. Pennington called chattel slavery not only tyranny, but also blasphemy and betrayal of God's claim and call on all of his children. For a slaveholder to admit the right of property in a man, said Pennington, amounts to stealing from God himself, whose image bearer and ambassador each person is called to be. For a slaveholder to deny the personhood of another race is to defy God's order of creation and Christ's order of redemption. As St. Paul reminds us, there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. Pennington was especially incensed that the slave system deprives slaves of their religious freedom. He recounted how Southern slave masters, for all of their Christian piety and faithful church attendance, sternly resisted the efforts of Christian missionaries and pastors to evangelize and to educate slaves. How Christian missionaries to Southern states were assaulted, whipped, and shot at, and sometimes killed just because they shared the good news of the Bible to slaves. How pastors and deacons who dared provide food and shelter to slaves were run out of their churches, homes, and towns at gunpoint. How black and white churches in both the North and the South that tried to provide sanctuary to fleeing slaves faced criminal prosecution and state confiscation of their properties, along with private acts of vandalism and arson that went unrequited and unindicted. The effects of slavery upon the Christian church are horrible to contemplate, Pennington wrote. All the great denominations in the country, Quakers excepted, have their hands stained with human blood. Think not of the bleeding hearts and manacled limbs alone, the nakedness, the starvation, the darkness of mind, the premature death, the murder, the theft, the rape of slaves, which the church has countenanced by action or omission. Think even more, said Pennington, of the loss of the immortal souls, to which the church is an accessory, an agent. This truly is a covenant with death, a pact with hell. Even freed or freeborn blacks have little religious freedom or social equality, Pennington lamented, now taking on racism more broadly. Blacks are treated with indignity in the white churches, forced to sit in their own pews if allowed in the door at all, and rarely allowed to stand in the pulpit or in leadership positions or to kneel at the rail. Even in free states, slaveholders are allowed to worship freely, but freed slaves and freeborn blacks sometimes cannot get in the door. Nearly all denominations, again Quakers accepted, are segregated, Pennington charged. This sacrilegious principle is blasphemous, especially in the church. In many locales, even in free northern states, free blacks must not only stay in their own pews and churches, they must also stay in their own houses and neighborhoods and schools and boarding houses and orphanages, asylums, charities, businesses, and more. They must not marry or employ whites. They must sit in their own seats in railroads, ships, ferries, and carriages. They may not vote, run for election, sit on juries, serve as policemen, carry non-military arms, or participate in any government offices or activities. Perhaps most ironic of all, they must often keep to their own separate black abolitionist societies. Men and women of color, even if not enslaved, are fundamentally separate and unequal, Pennington concluded. What then was the proper Christian response to this racism and slavery, to this national covenant with death? Resist, reform, and remove this odious legal institution, root and branch, was Pennington's response. But such resistance should be as nonviolent as possible, Pennington insisted, contrary to many sword-swinging Protestants in his day and before. Pennington was a principled pacifist, committed to nonviolence so much as possible. Colored people must bear and forbear, he wrote in 1842. They must accept Christ's injunction to love your enemies, do good to them that hate you, pray for those that spitefully use and persecute you, resist not evil, but overcome evil with good. And again, at a lecture given down the road in Glasgow in 1850, he declared, "We blacks have been wronged, but we do not wish to wrong others, for the spirit of the gospel commands us to tolerate our wrongs." For centuries, we have endured the most hard and intolerable oppression. We have been denied of the joys of property, education, and family, of all that is dear to humanity. But we have faith in God and in unalterable justice. We believe our emancipation will come, but without the help of the sword, end quote. But pacifism does not connote passivity, Pennington insisted, and turning the other cheek does not require martyrdom. He wrote, "The best way to fit a man for freedom is to lay upon him the responsibility of acting the part of a free man. And that requires him to speak and preach and petition and demonstrate and work with all legal means available to end the scourge of racism, slavery, and prejudice and vindicate the rights and liberties of all." That starts with the church, where racism, slavery, and segregation should find their least refuge and their strongest rebuke. That's why Pennington insisted on preparing for the ministry at Yale, even though no black student had ever set foot there before. He insisted on sitting in white pews and standing at white pulpits. He insisted on serving as the duly elected moderator of the Presbytery of New York, even though that had him awkwardly judging the ordination and discipline of white ministers. He urged black ministers to grace white pulpits and black parishioners to attend white churches and religious schools. He urged all persons to pray for slaves and for slaveholders too. He urged them to plead with slaveholders and their heirs to release their slaves. He urged churches to raise ransom funds for the purchase and release of slaves, as Pennington himself did to rescue his father and two brothers. And he led and sponsored Christian missions to slaves in the Americas and the Caribbean, insisting that the gospel provided ultimate liberation. Much like Martin Luther King Jr., a century later, Pennington regarded the church as the soul fire of any true human rights movement. Pennington also pushed this same message of racial integration and desegregation in other areas of life. He sat in white seats on public carriages, Rosa Parks-like, and successfully brought a lawsuit in New York to end segregated seating. To break down economic segregation, he urged fellow free blacks to enter the workforce with others, to watch out for each other on the job, to unionize and petition for labor and economic standards that were fair. He called for the universal suffrage in federal, state, and local elections for blacks and whites, men and women alike. He called for black men and women to serve on juries, especially when fellow blacks were on trial. And he urged black families to stay together or reunite after emancipation or escape. Even if slave laws had prevented couples from marrying and separated parents and children, and even if lustful masters and overseers had raped their female slaves, forced them into concubinage or grossest forms of immorality and debauchery, the intact marital family for him was a bastion and bulwark of liberty for men, women, and children alike. Pennington called loudly on ministers and other civic leaders to preach and publish and lecture constantly against slavery and work toward abolition at the local, state, and federal levels. He urged their congregants to raise funds to buy slaves and release them. He urged slaveholders to emancipate their slaves by contract or devise or gift. He pointed to the peaceful and successful British abolitionists as a model for American abolitionists. Britons, he said, had displayed their talents and energy in collecting and arranging their anti-slavery facts so as to carry the question home to the moral feelings, to the deep, deep natural sentiments of the nation. They pushed their arguments in thunder tones to the throne and to the Parliament, said Pennington, declaring that slavery is a monstrous crime which endangers the very existence of a nation by exposing it to the wrath of heaven, and that freedom is the slave's birthright, that justice demands his immediate and unconditional release. In the 1840s, Pennington was optimistic that all of these efforts at abolition and integration, starting with and in the churches, would eventually lead to the peaceful abolition of slavery in the United States too. He listed a number of examples of progress toward abolition and desegregation. In 1849, for example, he declared down the road now in Edinburgh, the mind of the slaves, as well as the free people of color in America, is rapidly expanding. It is coming more and more into contact with the great principles of truth and dignity, of civil and religious liberty, which has fired the hearts and minds of the Anglo-Saxons of earlier times and of the Protestant reformers most recently. But despite all of these efforts and advances, slavery remained firmly in place in the United States, and the number of slave states was in fact expanding, not contracting. Moreover, in 1850, Congress passed yet another fugitive slave law, and in the 1857 Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court confirmed that slaves were mere chattel, with no constitutional rights of persons that followed them into free states. This betrayal of the abolitionist cause at the highest level of government hardened Pennington's opposition to slavery and opened him to more strident means of opposition. Even in his earlier nonviolent phase, Pennington had insisted that the laws of slavery and fugitive slave return were unjust and could in good conscience be broken. Any law or agreement that is contrary to the law of God, he says, is by definition null and void and is not binding on the human conscience. In practical application, this meant that slaves themselves were free to escape their masters if they could do so without undue violence, as Pennington himself had done. As he wrote in 1843, although the cause of abolition is advancing, slavery is still the same for the individual slave. He still breathes in pain and in blood and in sorrow, and the only way to change his condition is to break his fetters. In a later speech, Pennington called escape a legitimate form of natural self-defense. He wrote, "The loud voice of natural conscience is the tribunal which charges every man with what he has a right to be and a duty to do. It tells the suffering slave what are his rights and what are his wrongs. It prompts him to escape from his oppressors. Chains cannot bind him. Bolts and bars cannot confine him. The horsewhip cannot deter him. Every fugitive slave who escapes is a monument to the sacred whisperings of the voice of God and of nature that tells him that he is free." Pennington further insisted that Christians could not, in good conscience, assist with the capture and return of fugitive slaves, regardless of what the law says. He wrote, "If you re-enslave a man, you not only rob him of his own dear liberty and happiness, you rob God of his right as a creator and redeemer of that man. It's even worse to collect a bounty for slave catching. A slave catcher, said Pennington, is a modern-day Judas Iscariot who betrays yet another son of God for 30 pieces of silver. Pennington tempered his pacifism even more when bloody conflicts broke out between African American and Irish immigrant communities in New York and New England in the later 1850s. He now clearly asserted for the first time the right of blacks to use arms or other mortal means for necessary and proportionate self-defense. He wrote, "There is no principle of civil or religious obligation that requires us to live on in hazard and to leave our person, property, our wives and children at the mercy of barbarians. Self-defense is the first law of nature," he concluded. After the Civil War broke out in 1861, Pennington further encouraged African Americans to enlist, and himself volunteered to serve as a military chaplain. Colored men, he said, should enter the army in force for the strength it will give them, the education they will obtain, the pay they will get, the good service they will do for God, this country, and the race. Pennington admitted that he was thankful that the Civil War was started by the slaveholders and not by the slaves. Indeed, had the slaves risen and attacked at Fort Sumter, the world would have cried out against them as the perpetrators of an unjust war. But now, no one can see that this is not a just war. No one could oppose emancipation on account of the turbulence and the bloodthirstiness of the slaves. Pennington noted that his enslaved brethren see clearly the hand of God in this war. They believe God has risen to make inquisition for blood, to purge the land by the blood of the guilt which rests upon it because of its slavery and its slave law. And slaves are willing to leave that cause to God alone in the assured faith and hope that God would send deliverance and would use them to find a better way. Pennington's remarkable struggle for what he called the sacred dignity, liberty, and equality of all is an inspiration for those of us struggling today against the many ugly forms of pathos that beset us at home and abroad. We can take inspiration from his rise from a beaten, raped, and battered slave youth to the leadership of church, state, and the abolitionist cause worldwide. Pennington stood firmly in the Protestant, especially the Calvinist tradition. He repeated cardinal Protestant themes of rights, resistance, and revolution by a covenant community called to worship God before men. He repeated the central premise of Protestant rights talk, that religious freedom is the mother of many other rights for individuals and communities. He repeated the Protestant mantra that reform and renewal of law, politics, and society must begin first and foremost in the church. And he repeated the Protestant ethic that a Christian church and community must always be restless to reform, semper reformanda, particularly in times of spiritual and political turmoil and tyranny. But Pennington added appreciably to this Calvinist and broader Protestant tradition by treating chattel slavery as another form of tyranny that needed to be resisted and reformed just as earlier revolutionary movements had done with spiritual and political tyranny. Emancipation from slavery, Pennington believed, must begin with proclamation of the gospel and the free exercise of faith. Just as God miraculously led his chosen people out of the house of bondage, just as God's grace irresistibly leads his elect from their bondage to sin, so God will ultimately break the fetters of human slavery, Pennington believed. God equips the conscience of each slave to know that he or she is endowed with liberty and has the right to break free from the fetters of slavery and escape to freedom when the time comes. God also sears the conscience of every slave master to know that slavery is wrong and emancipation is right, whatever the unjust laws and false prophets of the day might tell them. God calls on everyone to exercise the threefold office of prophet, priest, and king on behalf of slaves. As prophets, to speak powerfully in opposition to slavery and racism and injustice. As priests, to evangelize slaves and masters and provide pastoral care, comfort, and sanctuary. And as kings, to work hard to break those unjust laws of slavery that betray God's word and work hard for justice and mercy, rights and liberties for all. But Pennington was no sword-swinging revolutionary, like some of his Protestant forebears. Anticipating by a century the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr., Thurgood Marshall, Andrew Young, and so many others, Pennington advocated primarily nonviolent resistance against slavery and racism. He led sit-ins and lawsuits, political protests, and constitutional challenges. He advocated the integration of churches, schools, charities, and public accommodations. He encouraged blacks to prepare and place themselves in positions of leadership in all sectors of society, starting with the church, whose segregation of blacks and whites and exclusion of slaves he called outrageous heresy. The church was the sole fire of the human rights movement, Pennington believed, just as religious freedom was the mother of many other human rights. Freedom of conscience and free exercise of religion are the first freedoms of any constitutional order, he argued, the first pillars of a just democratic society. Pennington, in prescient and prophetic ways, anticipated the 20th century civil rights movement in America, led especially by Protestant black churches. He anticipated the reality that the more fully the state protects religious freedom, the more readily the church helps in the great task of bringing liberty and justice for all. He anticipated Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous saying that, quote, if the church will free itself from the shackles of a deadening status quo and will speak and act fearlessly and insistently in terms of justice and peace, that will rekindle the imagination of mankind and fire the souls of men, imbuing them with a glowing and ardent love for truth, justice, and peace. Pennington also anticipated our late modern discovery that religion is a cornerstone of human rights and indeed indispensable to constitutional order. Even in today's liberal societies, religions help to define the meanings and measures of shame and regret, of restraint and respect, of responsibility and restitution that a human rights regime presupposes. They help to lay out and tie down the fundamentals of human dignity and human community and the essentials of human nature and human flourishing upon which human rights regimes are built. Moreover, religions stand alongside the state and other institutions in helping to implement to protect the rights of a person and community, especially at times when states are weak, distracted, divided, cash-strapped, corrupt, or non-existent. Religious communities can create the conditions and sometimes the prototypes for the realization of civil and political rights of speech and press, assembly, petition, and more. They can provide a critical and sometimes the principal means of vindicating the rights of education, healthcare, childcare, labor organization, employment, artistic opportunity, and more. And churches offer some of the deepest insights into the duties of stewardship and servanthood that lie at the heart of environmental care and what we now call the rights of nature. And finally, Pennington challenges us to see that tyranny comes in many forms beyond the tyranny of the totalitarian state or the authoritarian church. Other legitimate authorities, too, in families, schools, corporations, hospitals, charities, farms, factories, unions, movie houses, locker rooms, and other institutions, wield enormous, but often invisible and unchecked power. And these authorities can become corrupt, abusive, and can crush the rights and the dignity of their local subjects with as much cruelty and devastation and outrage as the early modern state inflicted on their local subjects. Even more distressing are the great number of illegitimate but powerful authorities that have emerged in recent years that now exercise massive tyranny at home and abroad. Gangs and drug cartels who hold whole nations hostage to their malevolent designs. Pimps and sex traffickers who control and strangle the lives of tens of millions of trafficked women and little children worldwide. Hackers with keyboards, shooters with machine guns, terrorists with global networks who have caused such massive suffering at home and abroad. Particularly in contrast to the loud and brash nativist and xenophobic voices that we now hear today on both sides of the Atlantic, we can take comfort and courage from Pennington's abiding message of hope and resilience, of peace and reform, of righteous protest and rights-based living, of just war and juster reconstruction, built on the foundations of family, church, and school, of democracy, constitutional order, and rule of law, and of the firm resolve to ensure that every member of society may enjoy their sacred dignity, liberty, and equality. Thank you very much.
Professor Witte, thank you so much for such a challenging but fascinating lecture. We have some time for questions and answers. If you'd like to ask a question, if you could raise a hand, and when I offer the floor to you, if you could speak into the microphone that's in front of you, you'll allow us all to hear. You'll need to press the button on the right-hand side of the circle in front of you to be heard.
Professor Witte is asked to elaborate on the role of Quakerism in the story of Protestant rights, discourse and thinking.
Quakers really are anomalies in the colonial period in the United States as well as in England before William Penn and his company went across and eventually established the state of Pennsylvania, the colony before. Quakers have drawn from the tradition of toleration, of love, of peace, of literacy, of openness, of embrace of all, regardless of race and creed and color and ethnic origin. That was one of their founding mantras. They self-described as Christians. The Charter of 1682 that creates Pennsylvania as a colony insists that it's a Christian colony, but dedicated to free exercise of all and establishment of no religion. And in that sense, they were anomalous in the 17th century. When they preached that gospel here in England, they ran into Anglican and Presbyterian establishments and ran into the reality that there was a religious caste system in place with Anglican conformists and tolerated Protestants and Jews and Catholics, no thank you. And here are the Quakers arguing to the contrary, that under the sovereignty of God, we must recognize that religious pluralism is a good rather than a bad, and it should be left to God, the cultivator of the garden of religion, to decide which form of faith should flourish and which form of faith should fade. That message in the 17th century was the object of scorn, made the Quakers pariahs, made them very unwelcome in places like New England, where the Quakers were treated with great disdain by the Puritan authorities. The 4 Quakers that insisted on coming back were hung on the Boston Common. Quakers were constant whipping boys and girls in the evolution of 18th century republicanism. but they were consistent in their basic teachings that I just described, and that insistence eventually began to draw respect, because the argument for religious pluralism in particular began to take root. And the argument that we have good rather than bad in recognizing a variety of peaceful communities in our own geographical area may be something we want to take into account. Why should we have a purity narrative? Why should we insist upon one faith, one territory, one baptism, and all others being viewed as heretics or as dissenters? Maybe it's better to flip the paradigm. And in the 18th century, more and more non-Quakers began to embrace that Quaker message as a way of respecting God's sovereignty over the conscience, the nature, the natural teachings that every person can enjoy. And they added utilitarian arguments to this, which the Quakers rejected. And the utilitarian arguments were arguments that James Madison starts making famous in his discussion of factions in Federalist Paper number 10 and 51, where the idea was, well, it's good to have multiple factions, good to have multiple sects, multiple denominations, checking and balancing the other. They provide, as Thomas Jefferson says, a role of censor morum over the other, keeping them from excess, keeping one of them from dominating, ensuring that each of them is going to be tested and contested in their fundamentals. And kind of early religious Darwinism, a marketplace of religious ideas idea begins to emerge. That idea gets ensconced. Second really important thing that the Quakers do is they are in the vanguard of abolitionism because of the teachings that they have in general about humanity and about society and about equality and about toleration for all. They find the institution of chattel slavery an abomination. An abomination just in the sense of common sense, but an abomination against the very scripture which they adhere to as well. And while more selective than hard-nosed sola scriptura Puritans, pick out these passages. Come on now. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. We're all one in Christ Jesus. Aren't we? Aren't we? Shouldn't we be as a guiding maxim for what we're about? The argument against the gratuitous cruelty against a particular race and a particular being because of how they happen to have been born. The idea of matrilineal descent into slavery and inescapable condition except at the discretion of the master. It was an abominable form of tyranny. And early on, already in England and certainly after 1680s in Pennsylvania, that message becomes important. That too is unpopular. Protestant denominations, Catholics in the day, many others were happy participants in the slave trade. Even if they lived in one of the free states north, many of those chartered companies in Boston and New York and Pennsylvania nonetheless participated in the slave trade to their great profit. And again, the Quaker message ran deeply afoul of those fundamental convictions. But over time, together with other voices, including Calvinist voices, Presbyterian voices that we see illustrated by Pennington, the movement toward abolitionism begins to take hold. But it takes a bloody civil war. 600,000 people killed, untold millions maimed and harmed and orphaned and widowed before we have a settlement of that. And I dare say the settlement, even born of war and even ensconced in civil rights acts and Reconstruction amendments, the vestige of that still has not ended, as we see in the United States still today.
Professor Witte is asked whether Pennington was influenced by the writings of John Woolman, a prominent Quaker campaigner in the mid-1700s, and whether there was a parallel to Pennington's thought in Roman Catholic thinking around the same time.
Books that he had in his library that ended up getting sold to ransom his brothers we don't have a preserved list of that. So we don't really know to what extent he drew on particular figures beyond Luther and Calvin and Knox and others that he periodically would adduce, but very generically, not with any particular chapter and verse citations. So I just don't know that story of the historical pedigree of some of his ideas. I do know that he was very sympathetic to the Quakers, in part from his own autobiography, being taken in as an escaped slave, and in part because they tended to sit with the abolitionists in leadership in many of the northern states, including in New York, where they had prominent positions in the abolitionist forces. Yes, the Catholic tradition is going through its own deep reflection on this. As you know, since we're dealing with Lord Gifford and natural theology, there is a natural argument for slavery that we inherit from Greco-Roman times, and that people can, consistent with, if not the jus naturale, consistent with the jus gentium, the common law of nations, we can recognize that some people are slaved and some people are not slaved. That old tradition is perpetuated in the civil law and common law and picked up in Catholic circles throughout the Middle Ages and throughout early modern times. What's new in the American story, and eventually the Americas story, Brazil and others in the Caribbean participating, is the chattelization of the slave. That a slave now has lost personhood, that a slave has lost basic rights of personhood, that they've been reduced in many ways to simply the prerogative of their master, with very little constraint upon what the master can do to them. And that a slave status is simply something that you are born to, that comes to you because you have enslaved mother. You, by definition, regardless of who your father is, you are a slave, which of course creates these horrible systems of breeding and other things that go on in the ugliest times of the slave code system. That system is in place in Catholic countries too. Catholics also participated in the transatlantic slave trade. The very, very robust Brazilian slave trade in particular, but other parts of Latin America too, were very deeply engaged in many of the same kind of atrocities that we see in the Americas. The slave trade in Brazil goes on for 40 more years. Long after the American slave trade is over in 1808, it continues in Brazil, I think, to 1858 or 1856. And those principally are Catholic traders. So what is the response? The response is an academic response first. The academic response, building on the School of Salamanca, people like Vittoria and Las Casas and others who had spoken very powerfully against the abuse of indigenous peoples, against the use of slave labor in general, let alone slave labor that gets chattelized, are powerful early sources that echo in 18th and 19th century discussions in Catholic circles. Interestingly, those arguments have a very anomalous application, because here's Francisco Suarez, one of the great, great synthesizers of this neo-Thomist movement in Salamanca. And he writes these beautiful, wonderful books on natural law and natural philosophy and natural rights, and extraordinary. And he, amongst others, goes after the participation of the Catholic Church in the condonation and even participation in actuality in slavery. And we should not enslave indigenous peoples. We should not render indentured servitude the equivalent of slavery. And then, very sadly, Suarez says we shouldn't do that to the natives. We should instead import blacks from Africa. And all the arguments are there. All the arguments of dignity and equality are there. All the arguments of humanity are there. All the arguments about Imago Dei are there. And then they are color-coded by this rebuke of his own arguments, by a paragraph or two throwaway line. And that throwaway line becomes one of the, for 100 plus years, becomes one of the crucial texts on which Catholic moral theologians and philosophers hold until finally these things are gradually removed. But there is no, so far as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, so far as I know, there's no universal papal encyclical on point. It takes until 1880 in Leo XIII's encyclical Libertas, where for the first time I can see a powerful rebuke of slavery for the sake of the liberty that God has given us as human creatures and nature has given us as part of our human natures. It takes a long time. And that's not to condemn the Catholic Church there, but it is to recognize that we have clay on our feet and blood on our hands in the Christian traditions which we inhabit.
Professor Witte is asked to elaborate on how a Calvinist reformation of rights would differ from a Lutheran reformation of rights.
Pennington, in part because of his eclectic education, in part because he's looking for anybody who is an ally, Pennington kind of alights onto the Protestant tradition with less concern about the niceties of Lutheran versus Calvinist distinctions. He's also taught at Yale Divinity in the 1830s, where those denominational divisions are eroding and general Protestantism becomes a little bit more common. If you want to get real hard-nosed denominationalism, go down to Princeton Theological Seminary. You can get it all there. But at Yale, it's a softer kind of generic Christianity. So part of it's that. It's his own, Pennington's own particular eclectic sourcing of his argument. The argument that I'm pressing in the book is not to pretend that Calvinism has a monopoly or even the dominant influence on the development of new kinds of rights or new applications of traditional rights talk or new reformations of rights talk. It's simply to say, look, in this tapestry, this fabric of different traditions that contribute to what we now call human rights and liberty for all and religious freedom for all, there is a thread called the Calvinist thread. A thread that deliberately tries to find its origin in John Calvin's own teachings, that deliberately tries to work within the premises of followers that reappropriated and revised that tradition in light of the new exigencies of the day. And it's that story that I want to try to tell, with no pretense that that's the only story, and but granting each figure that speaks as a titan in that tradition, granting each of them their particularity or their eclecticism in their sourcing. Some of these guys, another guy that's going to be featured pretty powerfully in my story is Abraham Kuyper, his 19th century Dutch theologian, minister, prime minister of the Netherlands, founder of the Free University of Amsterdam. Well, he's very proud of his Calvinism and very chauvinistic sometimes in his denominational particularity as a Dutch Reformed minister. But boy, is he eclectic. He reads the church fathers, he reads Aquinas, he reads some of the medieval scholastics, Occam and Scotus in particular. He dabbles around in some of the Salamanca jurists that I discussed with your colleague here. He's eclectic, and I want to grant him his eclecticism. And part of the reason for that eclecticism in Kuyper's case, and I dare say also in Pennington's case, is these guys, apropos the Lord Gifford's inspiration, these guys are trying to make a natural argument, a natural law and a natural rights argument. And the argument then becomes, look, natural law is not a particular denominational expression of what natural law is. No, natural law is reflected in both teachings and practices of all God's people. And anybody, if you believe in the universality of a set of natural instincts or a set of natural dictates or a set of natural promptings of conscience, the argument becomes, inevitably, other communities are going to have their own way of thinking and doing and acting and practicing that natural law in action. And what they say and how they deal with it and their casuistry around it is interesting. And that kind of informs the methodology of this second book in the Reformation of Rights series. And if I may be so bold, that's kind of my take too, in the sense that I'm working on the third book in this series, and that's going to be kind of the modern kicker, and looking at some of the modern rights theorists who self-identify as Calvinists and then apply the tradition in new ways, new interesting and creative ways. People like Nick Waltersdorf and Herman Doyeweerd and Johann van der Weiver and David Little and a few others who are out there doing this creative and interesting work. And then I'm going to try at the end to kind of have a chapter or two on Here I Stand, and it's going to be kind of my take. And my take is going to be informed by this general natural law methodology, this general appeal to what I would call, as a Christian Reform guy growing up, the order of nature or the created order, but in many ways is a kind of the product of common grace, general revelation that people can absorb and act on, and the way they act on it and write about it is interesting. No denomination has a monopoly on the wisdom of God. And as a consequence, when that wisdom is reflected in other traditions, I'm interested in seeing what they say.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of our time together this evening. I wonder if you might allow me to do three things briefly. The first is to encourage you to continue the conversation with Professor Witte and each other over wine or a soft drink at our reception, which follows immediately after this lecture. It takes place in the Linklater rooms, which are just 2 minutes walk away. And I wonder if colleagues might be kind enough to help direct people there at the end. The second item is to encourage you also to take note of the forthcoming lectures in this Gifford series later this semester. Most immediately, we're back again in 2 weeks' time to hear from Professor Robert Macaulay on religions and their cognitive kin. And finally, I wonder if you might join with me in expressing once again our appreciation to Professor Witte for his paper, for his willingness to converse with us so graciously, and for that sneak preview of work yet to come. We're deeply grateful.